This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 344 entitled Avoiding the Personal Incredulity Fallacy. So as we continue to work through our study of the logical fallacies and how to avoid them, we have arrived at the personal incredulity fallacy. Now, this particular fallacy, which seems to be unfamiliar by name to many, it occurs when somebody rejects or dismisses a claim or argument simply because they find the argument difficult to understand or to believe. So instead of engaging with the evidence or the reasoning behind the claim, the person relies on their own lack of comprehension as a basis for rejecting that claim. So, what are some common ways the personal incredulity fallacy is committed in the year 2024? Why is this fallacy unhelpful in our dialogues and debates about the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus? And how should we debate and discuss Christology and theology without falling prey to the personal incredulity fallacy? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is defining the personal incredulity fallacy. That's what we do. We define our terms before we go and we run with them. So, as I've already mentioned, the personal incredulity fallacy occurs when somebody rejects or dismisses an argument or claim simply because they find it difficult to understand. It's difficult for them to believe, they think it's too complex, and so they use that as an excuse to dismiss it. So here's some examples based on things that could potentially occur in 2024. So imagine someone wants to talk about quantum mechanics, not a particular topic that I am well versed in. But if someone was to say that quantum entanglement just sounds like magic to me, particles influencing each other instantly over long distances, that can't be real. But quantum mechanics often defies common sense and intuition, and this leads people to dismiss some well-established scientific principles simply because they can't reconcile them with their everyday understanding of the world. What about economic theories? Someone might make the claim that I can't believe that printing more money could ever be a solution to an economic crisis. It just seems like that is just going to lead to inflation, so all of those policies must be wrong. But this person is just rejecting complex economic policies or theories because they just seem counterintuitive. They don't actually engage with nuanced economic reasons or evidence that might actually support them. What about when it comes to space exploration and astronomy? Well, someone might make the claim that I just can't believe that we can observe planets orbiting stars light years away. That just seems impossible to get any meaningful information from such a long distance. So I think that all of these so-called discoveries are probably being exaggerated. But this person is committing the fallacy. They find it hard to comprehend how we can gather data from distant stars and planets, and this person therefore doubts the legitimacy of these scientific findings. What about when it comes to AI, artificial intelligence? Well, someone might claim that I don't understand how a machine can be smarter than a human. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So the suggestion that AI could be taking over jobs or making decisions can't possibly happen. But this, of course, is the personal incredulity fallacy. This perspective rejects the advancements and potential risks of AI, not based on evidence or expert analysis, but simply because this particular individual finds them hard to believe or to understand. So hopefully that covers enough examples in order for us to see why this fallacy is defined as it is. So, why is the personal incredulity fallacy fallacious? So it's fallacious because it substitutes subjective disbelief or a general lack of understanding for a rational evaluation of an argument or claim. And we can see this in several different examples. So one way in which it is fallacious is that it favors subjectivity over objective analysis. What do I mean by this? Well, the fallacy is rooted in someone's personal feelings or perceptions rather than an objective examination of the evidence or reasoning. Just because something seems unbelievable or difficult to understand to one person doesn't make it false or invalid. This relies on an individual's subjective experience as a measure of truth, which is never a reliable method of assessing the validity of a claim. Number two, it relies on ignorance instead of evidence. The personal incredulity fallacy often reflects a lack of knowledge or understanding on the part of the person making the counterargument. However, ignorance of the subject matter does not constitute evidence against it. Rejecting a claim due to someone's personal ignorance bypasses the necessity to actually engage with the evidence or the arguments that have been presented. And this, unfortunately, is going to lead to an uninformed conclusion. Number three, complexity and truth are not mutually exclusive. There are many truths, particularly in science, philosophy, or technology, that are indeed complex. And their solutions may not be immediately intuitive. So by dismissing these truths simply because they are complex or they're difficult to grasp ignores the fact that complexity does not negate validity. This assumes that if something cannot be easily understood or believed, then it cannot be true. This is the logical fallacy. And number four, it avoids engagement. By relying on a misunderstanding or disbelief as the reason to reject a particular claim, the personal incredulity fallacy avoids meaningful conversations in regard to a particular topic. It prevents the person from considering any counterarguments, evidence, or deeper explanations that might resolve their confusion. And it stops the process of critical thinking and exploration, which leads to a premature, unfortunate, and often incorrect dismissal of good, valid points. So that's why this fallacy is fallacious, and we should abandon using it immediately. Let's move to our second main point, point number two, which is the main reason why people listen to these episodes. Point number two is common personal incredulity fallacies in Christological debates. And I'm pretty sure you're going to hear several of these that you have heard many times in your life if you're someone who is interested in Christology in religious studies. So here are several examples of people committing the fallacy of personal incredulity as it pertains to arguments regarding the deity of Christ or the Trinity or atonement or several other things. Example number 1. I just can't understand how someone could reject something as important as the Trinity and still claim to be a Bible-believing Christian. If this person simply can't see the Trinity in Scripture, then they must be completely wrong. But this is the personal incredulity fallacy. Their statement dismisses any non-Trinitarian interpretation of Scripture because the speaker's personal incredulity, rather than actually engaging in theological reasoning or scriptural evidence that is actually presented by these non-Trinitarians. Example number 2. I can't understand this concept called wisdom Christology that scholars keep talking about. I'm a simple person who just takes the Bible for what it says. So something as complicated as wisdom Christology could not possibly be what the New Testament authors were teaching. But this is the fallacy. This statement dismisses a widely recognized Christological concept due to its complexity and a failure to understand the arguments that are made by these scholars. It also avoids the Old Testament basis for wisdom Christology and the logical flow of argument from the Old Testament portrayals to the New Testament portrayals of Christ. Example number 3. I can't believe that the early church could have misunderstood something as important as the nature of the only true God. The Trinity must have always been the clear, dominant teaching of the capital C Church, because it's just unthinkable that Christians could have been so confused on a topic of this magnitude. This is a textbook example of the personal incredulity fallacy. This response dismisses historical evidence or scholarly discussions about the clear development of the Trinitarian doctrine based on their own personal disbelief, rather than actually engaging with the complex historical development and the nuances of early Christian theology in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. Example number 4. I can't believe that someone could read the New Testament and claim that Jesus had to be a real, genuine human being in order to atone for sins. It does not make sense to me that a man, one of God's creation, could bear the sins of the world. Only God can do that, in my opinion. So Jesus had to be fully God in order to die for my sins. But this, of course, is an example of the fallacy. This statement just dismisses Unitarian interpretations of the New Testament based solely on the speaker's personal disbelief and failure to engage with the actual evidence. The speaker is not engaging with the arguments or the evidence that Unitarian interpreters regularly present. Next example. If the Trinity wasn't true, how could Christians throughout history have believed it? If it's so unbelievable to think that so many people could be wrong about something so central to the faith, that is just something that I cannot fathom. But this is, again, the personal incredulity fallacy. This argument dismisses objections to the Trinity by appealing to the incredulity of a supposed widespread error, rather than actually addressing the substance of theological, scriptural, or logical challenges to the doctrine of the triune God. How about this example? I just cannot understand how anyone could read John chapter 1, verse 1 and not see the triune God. If someone interprets John 1:1 differently, then they must be reading it wrong, because it is just so obvious to me. It's just right there, and I'm reading the text for what it says. This, of course, is the personal incredulity fallacy. This statement dismisses alternative interpretations of scriptural passages that are commonly cited to support the Trinity, and the speaker relies on his own inability to see the text in light of other differing views. How about this one? Staying in the Gospel of John. I just don't understand how you could read John 20:28, where Thomas says to Jesus, "My Lord and my God," in any way other than directly calling Jesus God, which proves, in my opinion, that he is fully divine. Everyone knows what God means, so anyone who does not interpret John 20:28 this way is not being a sincere reader of the Bible. This is the fallacy we've been talking about. This argument fails to listen to alternative interpretations, which either point to the Jewish principle of agency, where Jesus fully represents the only true God in the Gospel of John, or the lexical data that demonstrates that the noun God, in Greek theos, is used more loosely, sometimes to refer to human representatives of the true God, without actually confusing those representatives and collapsing them with the one true God who sent him. So as you can see, there are several opportunities for examples of people committing this particular fallacy. And again, the point of the fallacy is that someone will say, what you're trying to tell me is just unbelievable, it's too difficult, it's too complex, and I can't make sense of what you're saying, and so that is the reason why I'm going to reject what you're saying, instead of taking the time to listen to the flow of the argument, to look at the evidence, and to look at the data that is being presented. So, number 3, our third point of the day is how to avoid committing the personal incredulity fallacy. How can we make sure that we don't fall prey and make these silly mistakes? I have several tips for us. Number 1 is the fact that, you know what? We need to educate ourselves. We need to educate ourselves rather thoroughly. When we encounter an argument or an idea that we find difficult to understand, take some time to research and educate yourself on that topic. Read from a variety of sources, especially those sources that offer an opposing view. There are a lot of people that are just opposed to doing this, but by doing so, you give more legitimacy to the research that you're doing. So if you find a particular theory, like quantum mechanics that we were talking about earlier, if you find that confusing, instead of just waving it away with your hand and dismissing it, look for some explanations from reputable scientists. Watch some educational videos or read up from some books that will attempt to simplify the concepts in a way that you can understand. So the first thing is that we have to educate ourselves thoroughly. The second tip is that we actually have to engage with the evidence. Focus on the evidence and the reasons offered behind the claim, rather than just relying on your immediate reaction to it. Ask yourself this question: what is the evidence for this particular claim, rather than asking, do I believe this is true? So if someone is going to argue that a certain historical event happened, like the early church gave up belief that God is one and they adopted a different doctrine saying that God is three persons, look into the historical documents. Look into any sort of archaeological findings that are available and read up on the expert analyses that both support and also those that attempt to refute this claim. We have to engage with the evidence. We can't ignore the evidence, or we're not being serious as interpreters. Number 3, we need to acknowledge when something is complex. We have to acknowledge complexity when it occurs. We should recognize that many truths, particularly in areas like science, philosophy, and yes, even biblical studies, are complex, and they may not be immediately intuitive. We have to accept that our own initial inability to understand something does not automatically make it false. I should also make the point that just because someone is making an argument and it is complex, that doesn't prove what they're saying. But we can't reject something simply because it's difficult to believe or that it is complex. We actually have to engage with the arguments and the evidence. So when we are discussing topics like the atonement of Jesus being a human being, being one of God's creation, we need to acknowledge that the complexity of the idea doesn't invalidate it. And we need to explore theological reasons behind it. Number 4, we need to practice humility when it comes to being an intellectual. Practice intellectual humility. We should be willing to admit when we don't understand something or when a topic is just beyond our current knowledge. And let me make this point clear to you. There are more topics out there about which you don't know anything than there are topics that you are an expert on. So we can openly acknowledge that there are most things in this world and in this universe that we just don't know anything about. Intellectual humility involves recognizing the limits of our own understanding and being open to learning more. Imagine that concept. So if someone's going to present a particular theory that you don't understand, instead of dismissing it, say, right now I don't fully understand that concept. Could you take some time and explain to me further or point me to some resources so that I can educate myself on the matter? And generally, thoughtful people are willing to help you with that. Number 5, we must engage in thoughtful dialogue. When encountering views that seem difficult to believe, we should engage in dialogue with others who hold these views, who are convinced by these views. Ask them questions and try to understand their perspective and the reasons that have convinced those persons. So if someone holds let's just say a political opinion that you find difficult to grasp or implausible, just ask them to explain why they believe it. Listen to their reasons and consider their arguments before forming a judgment. And number 6, lastly, we need to recognize and challenge our own bias. You have to be aware of your own cognitive biases and how they might affect your ability to fairly evaluate new information. We need to challenge our biases by actively considering alternative viewpoints. So if you tend to reject certain theological readings of Scripture because they conflict with your own existing beliefs, you should intentionally seek out and evaluate the evidence that people use to support those particular views. Recognize you have a bias, recognize you have a particular leaning, and acknowledge it, and seek out and evaluate the other evidence that people use to support their own findings. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we continue to work through the logical fallacies. And next week, we're going to look at the ad hominem fallacy. The ad hominem fallacy. So please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing on YouTube or iTunes, by giving us an honest review online, and by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. If you feel led to offer a financial donation, please check out the episode description for a PayPal link. And you can also subscribe with a paid monthly membership on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.